Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the U.S. to meet President Trump.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a whole stack of articles and analysis here.
Yeah.
And we're going to pull out the most interesting insights and implications for you.
For sure.
You might be thinking, okay, another political meeting, why should I care? But trust me, this is more than just a handshake and a photo op.
Exactly.
This visit is happening at a pivotal moment, with Trump shaking up global frameworks, trade, even how the U.S. engages in conflicts.
Totally.
And all of this directly impacts India.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at the context of shifting U.S. global priorities and what that might mean for India.
Right.
We'll also explore the personal dynamics between these two leaders, which are surprisingly strong considering they have very different viewpoints.
Yeah.
There's a lot more to unpack here than meets the eye.
Absolutely. So first off, this is Modi's first visit to the U.S. since the beginning of Trump's second term. And it really highlights the strategic importance of the U.S.-India partnership. Modi will be the fourth world leader to meet with Trump in his second term.
Wow.
Following the leaders of Israel, Japan, and Jordan.
Interesting. If we look at those countries, it paints a picture of the U.S. potentially shifting priorities.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if this signals a move towards strengthening relationships with countries that aren't traditional allies, but are key players in regions the U.S. is focusing on.
Yeah, and of course there's the whole Trump factor to consider.
Oh, for sure.
He's been pretty vocal about India's trade practices.
Absolutely. He's called out India for those high tariffs on U.S. goods, especially those Harley-Davidson motorcycles.
Oh, yeah. He seems to love those Harleys.
It seems like he's got a soft spot for those. But here's the thing. Despite that, Trump and Modi actually seem to have a pretty good personal relationship.
That's wild, because their political styles are so different.
Right.
It seems almost counterintuitive that they'd get along.
It really highlights how personal dynamics can play a huge role in diplomacy. But it's not just about handshakes and smiles. This meeting is happening against a backdrop of real tensions, especially when it comes to trade.
So what's at the heart of these trade tensions, and what are both sides hoping to achieve?
The main issue is that the U.S. sees India's tariffs as unfair barriers to American goods. They argue that these tariffs protect Indian industries at the expense of American businesses. India, on the other hand, wants to protect its domestic industries, especially those that are still developing. They argue that lowering tariffs would flood their market with cheaper U.S. goods and hurt local businesses.
So it's a classic economic tug-of-war.
Exactly. And both sides have strong arguments. The U.S. wants access to India's massive market, while India wants to safeguard its own economic interests.
And I'm seeing reports that India has already made some concessions, like reducing tariffs on certain goods. Is that a sign that they're willing to play ball?
It could be. It might be a way for Modi to appease the U.S. and create a more favorable atmosphere for the visit. But it's worth noting that these concessions might come with strings attached. India could be looking for something in return, like increased access for their own goods in the U.S. market.
So it's all about give and take.
Yeah.
Now, our sources also mentioned a potential shift in oil dynamics.
Okay.
Something about India possibly becoming a major oil purchaser from the U.S.
That's a direct result of the U.S. pushing its drill, baby, drill agenda. They're producing more oil domestically and need new markets to sell it to India. With its huge energy demands, could be a perfect buyer.
Okay.
This could be a win-win. The U.S. gets a new market for its oil, and India gets a potentially more reliable energy supplier.
But wouldn't that impact India's existing relationships with other oil-producing countries?
Absolutely. This is where things get really complex. India has long-standing relationships with countries like Iran and Venezuela, which are major oil producers. Shifting towards the U.S. as a primary supplier could strain those relationships.
And speaking of complex relationships, what about BRICS?
Yeah.
Keep seeing that mentioned in our sources, but I'm not sure I fully understand its relevance here.
BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's an economic bloc of emerging markets that's been gaining influence on the global stage. Now, Trump has expressed concern about BRICS, particularly its potential to challenge the dominance of the U.S. dollar in international trade. He sees any move away from the dollar as a threat to American economic power.
Oh, I see. So could this visit be a way for the U.S. to try and pull India away from BRICS and solidify its own economic ties?
That's definitely a possibility. The U.S. might try to offer incentives for India to prioritize its relationship with them over its BRICS commitments.
This is getting very interesting.
Yeah.
So we've got trade tensions, shifting oil dynamics, and the BRICS factor. All pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But it's not just about economics, right?
Right.
Our sources also point to other issues on the agenda,
Okay.
like security and the H-1B visa program.
Yeah.
Where do those fit into this complex puzzle?
Well, the security aspect is particularly interesting because India occupies this unique space in U.S. foreign policy. They're not seen as an adversary like China, but they're not a traditional ally like the UK or Japan either.
So somewhere in between.
It gives India a different kind of leverage. They can play both sides a bit, forging partnerships based on shared interests rather than traditional alliances. This visit could be a chance to see how they leverage that position, especially when it comes to issues like regional security and counterterrorism efforts.
And what about the H-1B visa program? I know that's been a major point of contention, especially with the Trump administration's crackdown on immigration.
Absolutely. The H-1B visa is crucial for Indian tech workers wanting to work in the U.S. The recent crackdown has created a lot of uncertainty and anxiety for those workers and the Indian tech industry as a whole.
So Modi will likely be pushing for some kind of compromise on that front.
It would make sense. He needs to show his constituents back home that he's fighting for their interests. But it's a tough sell, considering Trump's stance on immigration.
Wow, it seems like every single issue is layered with complexity. So how is Modi approaching all of this? What's his strategy going into this meeting?
Well, one thing that might work in his favor is that most of his current cabinet also served during Trump's first term. They've seen his negotiating style firsthand and know what to expect.
Yeah, they're not going in blind. Do we have any indication of what their approach might be?
There are signs that India is willing to compromise on certain issues, like we discussed with the tariffs and potentially becoming a bigger oil buyer. They're clearly trying to smooth things over and create a more collaborative environment.
But at the same time, they can't just cave to every demand.
Right.
They have to balance those concessions with their own domestic interests.
Exactly. Modi's walking a tightrope here. He needs to maintain a strong relationship with the U.S. while also protecting India's economic and strategic interests. And he has to consider the political ramifications back home. Any move that's perceived as weakness could hurt his popularity.
It's a high-stakes game of diplomacy. Now, there's one more piece of this puzzle that I found particularly interesting. Okay.
And it involves a country that isn't even directly involved in the meeting, Nepal.
Ah, yes, the ripple effect.
Exactly. The Trump administration's decision to freeze foreign aid could have a significant impact on Nepal, which has been a long-time recipient of U.S. aid. And given Nepal's close ties to India, this adds another layer of complexity to the Modi-Trump meeting.
It's like a geopolitical chain reaction.
Right. And it makes you wonder if the U.S. might be using this aid freeze as leverage in their dealings with both India and Nepal.
That's a fascinating angle. It certainly adds another dimension to the talks and shows how even seemingly unrelated events can become entangled in these high-level diplomatic maneuvers.
So we've got trade wars, oil deals, security concerns, visa issues, and now a potential aid standoff. It's a lot to keep track of.
It is, but that's the nature of international relations. Everything is interconnected.
This deep dive is already proving to be way more than just a political meeting summary.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack here. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, from trade and oil to security, and even the impact on Nepal. But what about Modi himself? What kind of leader is he on the world stage, and how might that influence his interactions with Trump?
That's a great question. Modi has cultivated a very specific image on the international stage. He's known for building strong personal relationships with other world leaders, and that includes Trump.
So that chemistry we talked about earlier could actually be a major asset in these negotiations.
Absolutely. Diplomacy isn't just about policies and agreements. It's also about building trust and rapport. If Modi and Trump can leverage that personal connection, it might help them find common ground on some of these tougher issues.
Almost like they have a head start.
Yeah.
A foundation of goodwill to build upon.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that Modi seems to be playing the long game. He's not looking for quick wins or flashy headlines. He's focused on building strategic partnerships that benefit India in the long run.
So he's thinking long term.
Yeah.
Looking beyond this one meeting.
Precisely. He's thinking about India's role in the world, its economic future, its security concerns, all of which are intertwined with its relationships with countries like the U.S.
So with all that in mind, what kind of approach do you think we'll see from Modi in this meeting? Will he be confrontational, pushing back on Trump's demands, or will he take a more conciliatory approach, emphasizing cooperation and compromise?
I think we'll see a mix of both. Modi is a pragmatic leader, He's not afraid to stand firm on issues that are core to India's interests, but he's also willing to compromise and negotiate when it's necessary.
It's that tightrope walk again, finding the balance between standing your ground and keeping the relationship intact.
Exactly. And it's a delicate dance, especially with someone like Trump who can be unpredictable and quick to react.
Now, one issue that I know is particularly important to Modi is the H-1B visa program.
Yeah.
It's been a thorn in the side of U.S.-India relations for a while now.
Absolutely. The Trump administration's crackdown on H-1B visas has created a lot of uncertainty for Indian tech workers who rely on these visas to work in the U.S. It's also had a ripple effect on the Indian tech industry, which has a significant presence in the U.S. market.
So how do you think Modi will approach this issue with Trump? Will he be forceful in advocating for the interests of those Indian workers?
He'll certainly have to address it. It's a major concern for India, both economically and politically. Modi needs to show his constituents back home that he's fighting for them.
But how do you push back against someone like Trump, who's made immigration restriction a cornerstone of his presidency?
That's the challenge. Modi might try to appeal to Trump's business sense, highlighting the contributions that skilled Indian workers make to the U.S. economy. He could also point out the negative impact that restricting H-1B visas could have on U.S. companies that rely on those workers.
It's almost like he has to find a way to frame it as a win for Trump, too.
Exactly. It's about finding common ground, showing how addressing India's concerns can also benefit the U.S. But it's a tough sell, and it'll be interesting to see how Trump responds.
This whole meeting feels like a high-stakes poker game, with each leader trying to anticipate the other's moves.
That's a great analogy. And the stakes are incredibly high, not just for the U.S. and India, but for the entire region.
Speaking of the region, can we zoom out a bit and talk about the broader geopolitical context? This meeting isn't happening in a vacuum, right? There's the whole U.S.-China rivalry looming in the background.
Absolutely. The U.S.-China rivalry is the elephant in the room, and it's something that both Modi and Trump will have to consider.
Because India is right in the middle of that rivalry, trying to balance its relationships with both superpowers. It's like being friends with two people who can't stand each other.
That's a pretty apt analogy. India doesn't want to choose sides, but it also can't ignore the fact that the U.S. is increasingly looking to India as a counterweight to China's growing influence in the region.
So India has some leverage here, right? They can play the U.S. and China off each other to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, yes. But it's a risky game. Aligning too closely with one side could jeopardize their relationship with the other. It's a delicate balancing act, and Modi will have to tread carefully.
So how do you think this rivalry will play out in the context of the Modi-Trump meeting?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think the U.S. might try to use this opportunity to strengthen its ties with India, potentially offering incentives or pushing for closer cooperation on security issues. They might even try to draw India into a more formal alliance against China.
But wouldn't that put India in a difficult position?
Absolutely. India has its own complex relationship with China, and they don't want to provoke a confrontation. They'll be cautious about getting too entangled in the U.S.-China rivalry.
It seems like no matter what India does, there are potential pitfalls. This whole situation is like a geopolitical minefield.
It is. And there's another major global trend that we haven't even touched on yet, climate change.
Oh, right, that little issue.
It's not a small issue at all. It's one of the most pressing challenges facing the world today. And it's an area where the U.S. and India haven't always seen eye to eye.
The U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement. India is still relying heavily on coal. They seem to be on different paths.
They are, but there's also potential for cooperation. Both countries are feeling the effects of climate change, and there's a growing recognition that they need to work together to address this global challenge.
So do you think climate change will be on the agenda for the Modi-Trump meeting?
It's hard to say for sure. It might not be a top priority given all the other pressing issues we've discussed, but it's certainly something that could come up, especially if Modi sees an opportunity to push for greater U.S. commitment to climate action.
It's amazing how all these different issues from trade and security to climate change are intertwined.
Exactly. That's the thing about international relations. It's never just about one issue in isolation. Everything is connected and every decision has ripple effects.
And it all seems to come back to those personal relationships, the dynamics between leaders.
Absolutely. Sometimes it really does come down to the chemistry between leaders, their ability to build trust and find common ground.
Like if Modi and Trump can tap into that personal rapport they seem to have, maybe they can navigate some of these complex issues and find solutions that benefit both their countries.
That's the hope. But even with good personal chemistry, there are still real differences in interests and priorities. It's not a guaranteed solution, just one factor among many.
This has been a really thought-provoking discussion so far.
It's been fascinating to unpack all these different layers with you.
We'll be back in a moment to continue exploring this complex diplomatic dance and what it means for the world. Okay, so we've talked about trade wars, security alliances, the role of personal relationships, and even the looming presence of climate change in this whole diplomatic chess match. But I think it's time we bring it back to you, the listener.
Okay.
What does this all mean for someone who's not sitting at the negotiating table?
That's a key question. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical weeds, but the reality is that the U.S.-India relationship has a direct impact on all of us.
Because these two countries are major players on the world stage.
Exactly. Think about it. They're both economic powerhouses, they're both nuclear powers, and they're both key players in regions that are vital to global stability.
So the decisions they make, or fail to make, will have ripple effects that reach far beyond their borders.
Precisely. The outcomes of this meeting could impact global trade, the fight against terrorism, the future of technological innovation, even the way we address climate change.
It's like that butterfly effect in chaos theory. A seemingly small event can set off a chain reaction with massive consequences.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to these seemingly distant diplomatic encounters. They might feel far removed from our daily lives, but they shape the world we live in.
Okay, so we've established that this meeting matters, but with so much at stake, what are some key things we should be watching for as this story unfolds?
Well, from a practical standpoint, keep an eye on the trade negotiations. Will they reach a deal that benefits both sides, or will tensions escalate, leading to a full-blown trade war?
Because a trade war between two economic giants, like the U.S. and India, would have global consequences, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It could disrupt supply chains, increase prices for consumers, and even trigger a global recession. It's not something anyone wants to see.
And what about the H-1B visa issue? Will Modi be able to secure any concessions for Indian tech workers? Or will the Trump administration hold firm on its restrictive immigration policies?
That's another key area to watch. The outcome of those negotiations could have a significant impact on the Indian tech industry, the U.S. tech sector, and the lives of thousands of workers and their families.
It's a reminder that these diplomatic encounters aren't just about abstract concepts like trade and security. They're about real people's lives.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the broader geopolitical context. How will the U.S.-India relationship evolve in light of the growing rivalry with China?
Right. Will this meeting signal a deepening of ties between the U.S. and India, potentially pushing India closer to the U.S. side in that rivalry?
That's the big question. And it's one that China will be watching very closely. Any move by India that's perceived as aligning too closely with the U.S. could have major implications for regional stability.
It feels like we're watching a high-stakes poker game unfold in real time.
I like that analogy. Each leader holding their cards close, trying to anticipate the other's move, knowing that the stakes are incredibly high.
And the outcome of this game could reshape the global landscape for years to come. It's a lot to think about.
It is, but that's what makes it so fascinating. We're witnessing history in the making, and the decisions made in these diplomatic encounters will shape the world we live in.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by the sheer complexity of it all. It's not as simple as friend or foe, good or bad. It's a tangled web of competing interests, shifting alliances, and unpredictable personalities.
It is, but that's the nature of international relations. It's rarely black and white. There are always nuances, always multiple perspectives to consider.
And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to dig deeper than the headlines, to understand the complexities behind these global events.
Absolutely, because the more we understand, the better equipped we are to engage in meaningful conversations, to ask critical questions, and to make informed decisions about the world we want to live in.
So as you follow this story, we encourage you to think critically, to consider different perspectives, and to ask yourself, how do you think this meeting will impact the future of the U.S.-India relationship?
And how might it reshape the global landscape in the years to come? It's a fascinating puzzle, and the pieces are still falling into place.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of international diplomacy. We hope this is giving you a new perspective on this complex and ever-evolving relationship between the U.S. and India. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning the world around you.